Hey guys, so today we're going to be just reviewing my Cornell Architecture portfolio, and it's going to be of interest for anybody who wants to see how artists' work develops, anybody who wants to get into particular schools or have some advice on that. It's going to be a far range of application for multiple people, so let's get right into it. So originally, when I first started my art journey, it was around freshman year, 4 years ago, and around that time, it's when COVID was hitting, especially later in freshman year, around 2020. And I was really interested in psychology, in particular Jungian psychology, the unconscious, how all of that worked. And that's how this artwork came about. So this is the first artwork in my entire portfolio. And you're going to see this large stippling drawing. And it took several hours. But the way that I went about it was that anything that unconsciously came to mind, I put into it. So I started out with a loose pencil sketch, and anything that kind of came to mind, like I wanted a big window, or I wanted something on fire in the background, just impulsive thoughts that kind of came to the forefront of my mind, I would put into this particular picture. So it was a very feeling based sort of image, and what was interesting about it was that I wasn't forcing anything to consciously come up. It's just like when you're sitting throughout the day and something impulsively kind of comes through your vision, or you just imagine something. And I took all of those, made a compilation, and that's the product of this. And what was interesting about this is that it ended up kind of metaphorically laying out the chaos that was there in my external environment at the time with COVID and the uncertainty in it. So I made a large stippling drawing of that, and you can see I'm gonna show a little bit of my caption down here if you're interested in that, because the captions in the way that you actually describe your work is equally as important to the admissions team as your actual visual portfolio. And I went up to Cornell in particular, and I spoke with the admissions director at the time for at least an hour and a half or a little bit longer than that. So I got to pick her brain about a lot of the things that they look for in particular. And I'm sure that, and this isn't just particular to Cornell architecture, right? This is what a lot of, and it isn't even particular to the major. They want to see very particular things, but it's common across a lot of different schools, even though there's a little bit of variance. So what was interesting about what they want to see is not necessarily a very developed artist in the sense that it looks really, really pretty or whatever. What they want to see is an interesting person and somebody who has a lot of potential, particularly for architecture. So they want your application to be interesting and unique, but not in a unique way that's kind of show-offy or sensational, and not unique in a way that everybody's is unique. So you can see a lot of art tips online to get into colleges or just in general to make your art more interesting is to try new mediums like making a picture on cardboard or something, to be unconventional like that. But a lot of the time, a lot of modern art looks conventionally unconventional, ununiquely unique, because it all starts melding into the same thing. And that's what I've kind of noticed is that if you go to a modern art exhibit, all the art kind of looks the same, in the abstract department especially. But anyway, they want something to be very interesting. And if you're interested in the world around you, you're going to be an interesting person. So I wasn't really trying to make something interesting for an admissions team back then. I was genuinely just interested in psychology. So that's how I made this first work. So going on to the second work, this is when I started becoming a little more technically involved with my drawings. So I'd done a lot of perspective stuff before, especially in middle school. I was really interested in 1 point, 2 point, all the way up to 5 point. That's what this is. And I really wanted to integrate the two things together with the technical ability that I'd gathered from a lot of the perspective studying that I'd been doing in middle school. And then I also wanted to meld that with a more kind of psychologically interesting drawing. So I did this one after COVID started to wane around 2021. I think it might have even been 2022, I'm not really sure. But when, masks were coming off and everybody could go outside their houses and we returned back to school. And I did the same exact thing and it became a little bit more serene. So I thought that was pretty interesting, because originally it was a person in the castle. And then the second drawing was them outside of the castle. And I talk about that in, again, my caption down here. You can see the speaker notes. You can read that if you want. Again, they don't want you to talk about really, really technical stuff. So although I love talking about technique, and I'm sure if you've watched a few other of my videos that I've made, I love, love, love technique. And I love talking about how you use values, how you use composition, all this other stuff. But art is really not interesting for the technique. It's what the technique can actually accomplish. That's why everybody's learning all the boring stuff. So if you're making a caption for other people, or even if you're trying to present a portfolio professionally, I don't think a lot of people want to hear about your technique almost at all. It's relevant here for the admissions team because it shows how you think about what you're making. But more so, they want to hear the emotional story that art usually conveys, the experience that art can kind of make. And if you approach it from a more emotional lens, or at least a more personal lens, at least for these admissions applications, it helps the admissions officer kind of get in your own head, in your own experience and what you were going through at the time. And it makes it more interesting than just rattling on about technique. So I still talked a lot about technique, because it's a physical process, but it's also, it's a more life experiential process. So anyway, I showed the original proposal, because this one I submitted for a high school class, but I was actually just doing it by myself, but I got a double dip, so to say. And then I took these references. These are the references that I used for this particular drawing, so it wasn't really like heavily referenced right here in my portfolio. But I put them there just so the admissions board could kind of see, where I was picking and choosing stuff and how I thought about things. So it is interesting to put your reference there because it does help them get into your physical process a lot more. All right, so this is when I was getting into oil painting, and this is when I was watching a lot of artists on YouTube, and this is part of why I started my YouTube channel for art, is because I really find a lot of information out on YouTube to really help my art journey, and I want to give back a little bit. But I started watching artists like Draw Mix Paint, so Mark Carter, Andrew Tischler, and the more, what would you say, entry level kind of people that you see on YouTube, and that's not to diss them at all. They're great artists and teachers too, but that's what people typically start watching. Paint Coach, for example, too. And that's when I was getting into oil painting as a medium, right? And I was experimenting with the exact same sort of thing, except this time I was from a dream that I had, and you can see down here in the speaker notes I'm going about that. And Cornell wants particular stuff like size, medium, if you completed it in class or independently from yourself. But that'll vary obviously with every single application that you're doing. So if you're applying to a different school, then you're going to want to change up to their particular needs, and they're going to specify that on their website, hopefully. Otherwise, you're below water. So anyway, so I did a process sketch here, and you can see this is when I was just working out the values and the general composition and all this other stuff. And you can see the thumbnails that I did. And I used to do a lot of thumbnails back then. I don't do as many now, but I still do preliminary sketches because I mainly work from a singular reference or a few, instead of just my imagination. But I did these preliminary sketches, and then I did a larger one, and then I finally did my oil painting. And what was interesting about this one is I was getting more into how the viewer psychologically processes art. So I was more interested in how do you lead the viewer to a particular part of the scene. And I remember in the dream that I had, the moons felt like it was the most significant part of the dream. And that was convenient because to make something the most important part of an artwork, and to make emotionally compelling art, you have to have a subject that's obvious, emotionally at least. People look at it straight away. It's convenient that the moon is really bright, and especially at night, everything else is really dark. So I also used the way that the clouds moved and like even there's a triangle you can see right here below the moon, and it points right up to it, right? So I was really getting into how people are processing, and unconsciously at least, following through compositions. And if I remember correctly, here or somewhere else, I kind of linked that to a little bit of architecture, because you can think about, if you can lead a viewer through a painting, then you can unconsciously lead a person through a trail or through a building, and it's about a lot of those unconscious cues. So I was trying to relate it to architecture the best that I could, because that's, of course, what I was applying to and what I'm really deeply interested in. So this is where I was getting into preliminary studies for a more three-dimensional model that I was making. And here's the thumbnail sketches that I had, and it's similar to the one I just showed you. So you have the thumbnails right here, a little graphite drawing, and then I did a charcoal drawing right here, and then I did another graphite drawing on the right. And these were all just purely out of imagination, using the stuff that I learned from 2-point perspective, 1-point perspective, depending on which one you're looking at. And that really helped me create these drawings, and it really set up a style that I wanted to create this three-dimensional build in. And so I did this three-dimensional build for sculpture class, and I spent around like 45 hours on it. And it was really interesting too. I tried to, and all this stuff, when I was making this, I wasn't thinking about making a cool application or a cool portfolio. I was just really genuinely interested in it. I spent that time making it because I found it compelling and I thought it was a good use of time. I found it interesting, right? And that's what they want to see, people interested in the world around them, not interested in getting in X school or, doing, you know, just make it as uncontrived as possible. Make it genuine and interesting. But anyway, so I was interested, I really wanted, there was a sculpture class project where you would make a gnome home out of materials that you had at your house. And I was like, okay, that's really cool. I haven't really done any 3D sculpture work, so this might be interesting. So I did a really quick sketch right here, as you can see, and I put, some labeling, grass, twigs, it's really rough. It didn't end up looking exactly like the final product over here on the right, but it was close enough. It shows the admissions that I was thinking about in this preliminary sketch. And then what I did is that I built it up with cardboard, and then I put this plaster wrap on it, and it wasn't like normal newspaper plaster wrap. It was more, I forget the particular term for it, but it's like a netting that you wet and then you smooth it out and then it'll harden. And that really made the whole structure more sound. So you can see here, that's my blurb right there. And of course you want your blurb to be really to the point, really simple to understand, and emotionally captivating and like unique, but don't try to make it unique. It might come off as, pretentious or whatever. So you just be genuine, and come at it from a more life experience approach, So like mine, as you can see, if you read some of the blurb here, the reason why I had to do all the home material stuff is because of COVID, of course. So like the full front half of my application actually had to do with COVID, but it wasn't in a way that I was trying to sob or make some sort of like force some emotional story. It was just the genuine circumstances under which I was creating this art and how it impacted it, So it wasn't too forced. All right, so the next few here is where I was getting a little bit more competent with oil painting. And this is when I was actually using more references, as in you have the reference, then you make a painting of the reference rather than just, creating a lot of it. And this is where I think I took a leap in my application a little bit, at least from the front half, and it shows that I was developing more as an artist because I was deeply interested in it enough to actually practice and get better at it. So that's what I think it was signifying. And this one, I just wanted to do a portrait of my twin sister. And then I was also interested in the way that I could create the fisheye effect, the 5-point perspective effect in actual space, as in it is an imaginary drawing. So this is actually one of my living room. And I took a reference photo and then I changed it up a little bit and I made it into that fisheye 5-point perspective effect. A lot of artists use that, in fact. I didn't know about it when I was doing it, but artists like Kim Jung-gi, he's passed away now, but he's a really, really cool illustrator. He does all of his stuff from imagination, in fact, but he uses 5-point perspective, which is really interesting. So I tried to do that on a larger oil painting of a room. And of course, this is where it starts getting more involved with architecture. And I always tried to think about the painting as a interaction between the subject and the environment. And I think that's where I made the good connection between artwork and architecture, because obviously there's implicit connections between being competent in painting and being a good architect, design, colors, etc. But to think about how to use the space and how the space interacts with the people who are actually going to be within it, I think that's where I made a better connection with it being about architecture. So anyway, that was that slide. And then this one was my cat. And it was that simple. It doesn't have to be that complex, right? It's just if you did a painting of your cat, put your cat in there, right? So I have the reference here, and then I have this quick charcoal study that I did, which had horrendous proportions. And I realized that afterward, and it was quite embarrassing. But so I did the actual painting, and I fixed all the proportional issues. And this one I was talking about getting the big picture, and this is where I was kind of melding in technique, an emotional story, and then relating it to architecture. And I think those are the 3 points that are really strong that you want to have in your application if you're making one. Particularly for architecture, but you want the emotional story and you also want the other thing if you're making just a professional portfolio as well. So I was talking about the larger composition here and how the way that it worked at a more specific and detailed stage of the painting is because the foundation was actually really simple. So you can see right here, This is the first layer that I did actually on this oil painting. And you can see that it's just like, you could count the shapes on one hand. That's how simple the composition was. There wasn't all these divided up light and darks like you can see right here. And that doesn't make this a bad painting, but it makes it less emotionally evocative. So that's the reason why this one just has much more drama to it. And you can feel something from it. And when people look at your artwork and they start abstracting out and trying to explain why they like it, that's how you know you're on the right path. Because a lot of the time they'll say, oh, well, it reminds me of sitting by the fire or something like that, or, you know, an experience I had as a child or whatever. But what they're actually doing is that they're subconsciously reacting to all the foundational work that you did, which is usually through abstract value shapes. And then they're what do you say? Justifying and intellectualizing why they like it consciously. Because they have a feeling unconsciously, and then, you know, of course, the conscious logical brain is going to try to come up for a reason why it's interesting. You know, it's kind of like how in divided brain patients for epilepsy, when you cut the corpus callosum, they'll pick up random objects and then they'll try to it gets a little complicated. But if you get a word flashing in your face and then it tells you to like pick something up and then you pick up the object, you're not going to consciously know why you picked up the object because the brains are split. And it's really simplified. It's like unconscious conscious, but that's obviously neurologically incorrect. But you pick up the object and then you'll try to explain why you picked it up. You know, I was always interested in X or whatever. CGP, I think, CGP Grey has a really good video on that, which is called You Are Too. I'd suggest watching that. But it's the same thing in art, right? So you have the subconscious cue, which is coming into your eyes, and you're processing it like that. And visual art gets processed rapidly quick. And that's why you need the subject to be so obvious. But then they'll come up with a logical explanation for why they like it. Oh, it reminds me of my cat. I love cats. Or, you know, it reminds me of sitting by the fire. You know, childhood experience, it doesn't matter. But that was interesting. So I was thinking about that, and I wrote a little bit about that. You can see this blurb down here. I know there's a little tangential, but it explains a little bit of my process as well. So here's a similar sort of vein, another dramatic painting that I tried to do. And this is of me by the floor. And I was explaining that, you know, I was stressed out about colleges and all this other stuff, and I just love to have the release in the afternoon with time to paint. So that's what I love to do, you know. So it's not trying to be anything more than it is, you know. It's simple, it's understandable, but it's also relatable, you know, because we all get stressed out about, you know, duties, responsibilities, whatever. And a lot of the time, the only way that you can really release from that is through hobbies and through other sort of cathartic outlets, right? And for me, it was art. So I just explained that, you know, in pretty simple terms, and then I told the process, and then, you know, that was it. So next one I did was of my mother, and my mother's very warm and nurturing, and she's a very empathetic person. So I decided to stage the painting based on that, you know, using a protective kind of dynamic. And then I also talked about, in a lot of these reflections, I'll try to like pick on myself a little bit, just like slightly, so it shows that I'm self-critical enough to actually improve, because obviously self-critique is critical if you want to actually improve as an artist. So I talked about how I made the dog a little bit too black, and that was more of an issue with the reference photo, but what happened is that he just kind of turned to a black hole. So I mentioned that was an issue, and I wouldn't be repeating that issue, especially if it's subject specific and it's integral to the actual articulation of what you're trying to say in the painting, like her protecting an animal or a person or whatever. Then it's absolutely necessary for you to logically know what's happening. Otherwise, when you get consciously confused or unconsciously confused, art just unravels. Like, it loses all of its divine power that it usually has. So confusion is just the epitome of ugliness. So I talked about how I wanted to make the delineation between the dog and the background kind of shapes a little bit better. So here's one I did of myself. I talked about how I'm a very like calm, chill person, but inside I'm usually like thinking a lot. So I have this idea of looking calm on the surface and then dramatic as far as the posing and the lighting and all this other stuff. And you can see that I edited the hell out of this photo. So all the values are almost completely different. And what aided that was doing this little pan pastel study. I love pan pastel a lot, but it's really hard to get details with. But I managed to do it in this. It was like about this big. It wasn't really that big. But I did that in this study, and then I showed this technique I was doing with thin washes underneath my actual painting. And I don't think it really came through in this particular painting because I was painting quite thickly, especially in a lot of certain places. but it did influence my color choice when I was actually placing it on the canvas. So that was interesting. But the whole idea is you grab the complementary of what's going to eventually be there, and then it shows through a little bit, and then it has this kind of prickly color effect. So if you look at certain artists like Morgan Weisling or more contemporary artists who play with color a lot, especially same value, different color, that kind of thing, then what they'll do is that their painting ends up looking like it's like flickering almost. It's really hard to explain, but I was trying to mimic that a little bit with just using the underpainting color and a thin wash over the top of it. It may or may not have come through. It looks a little bit, you can see a little bit more of it in person, but anyway, so my whole thing was talking about this. So this is where I'm getting into more. I have the emotional story, you know, delving into myself, understanding myself. And then I also have the technical explanation of it. And then I also relate it to architecture. So you can see that I try to do that in every single one of these slides. And I think that's all three of those are really necessary for the admissions officer to actually understand what you're saying, emotionally connect to it, and then understand how it relates to the thing that they're trying to admit you towards, right? So that's pretty integral. But I talked about how I used the idea of linear versus organic shapes and lines. And in this particular painting, a lot of the architecture around me was very geometrical and, you know, cut and straight versus the very vertical flowing dramatic lines. So that was that one. And then this was another similar one. It was, I like to make these little like blurb quotes. So if you follow me on Instagram, and this isn't plugging my Instagram, but I use a lot of these quotes as the captions for a lot of my paintings. And I kind of just wanted to represent myself through verbal and visual forms. So there's this, like, I kind of had this idea that since I'm very abstract minded, like, it kind of feels like I'm physical, and then the surrounding part of myself is very soft, and it feels more like a wash. It's almost similar to that. I'm not going to really get into the specifics of it because you can read it on here. But I wanted to show the difference between that, and I thought all three of these slides together with me by the window, and then this one of me physical and written, and also the other one of the chaos versus calmness. All three of those would kind of explain who I was as a person, because the admissions team wants to know who you are particularly, and they want to invest in you, right? And that's the same also if you're working in the industry. People do care about who you are as a person, your ethos, and, you know, your reputation a lot of the time, you know, and getting to know you as a good person, or as an interesting person at the very least, is vital for them to really, you know, be moved. So this is a white background. I might have changed it, I don't know why. But this was a painting that I did actually of the school that my sister was going to. And this one I did a lot of design work. And I made a video actually about how I designed this one in particular, so I won't go into that now. But this one turned out pretty well, I think. I was a little worried because this one is of UPenn, and my sister's going to UPenn. So I was putting the UPenn painting into a Cornell application was gonna be kind of sketchy. So I really, really tried hard to show that I wasn't really interested in the school. I was just making this as a gift to her when we part ways because we've been together for so long. So I explained that in the blurb, and I try to be very precise with my language to suggest that I didn't make this for a different, you know, school application and just happened to put it in here. But it worked out, obviously. So yeah, there's that one. And then this one, I went to Cornell a few times, actually. I visited there, and I took a reference photo of this church. This is Sage Chapel, and it's near the architecture building. It's just a really, really beautiful building, and I was really moved by it in person. And when you're taking references, it's really important to be moved by what you're looking at. Because if you're moved by something visually, it's very high likelihood that other people will be moved by the same thing. And that's just because people work very similarly unconsciously. You know, there's the whole idea of the personal unconscious versus the collective unconscious. And when something really speaks to you in an emotional way, a lot of the time it'll speak to other people. Not always, but a lot of the time. So if you have a reference that you are emotionally connected to, then you can make that reference as a painting, and other people will connect to it in a very similar way. They'll get a very similar feeling to you. Even though either of you can't logically kind of articulate why you like it, there's a kind of collective attention that gets brought to it. It's really interesting. But that's the way that I like to take references. So I took this reference because it was beautiful that the sun was setting there. The orange was obviously beautiful and stuff. added in a path there to lead the viewer there. So I was changing a bit of the reference and stuff, and they love to see that. They don't want to see you just slave copy something that shows absolutely no creativity at all. Uh, Especially if it's like, I wouldn't suggest doing very high detailed, TikTok like lip drawings or whatever. The stuff that you see on social media, I wouldn't suggest doing that. The very mainstream stuff, they don't want to really see that. Like, they're tired of seeing eye drawings, the really close up detailed eye drawings. They're tired of seeing the TikTok like Prismacolor, hyperrealism stuff. It just doesn't really show a lot of thought. And then also, they like to see you using your own references. So if you grab the reference and then you just pull it off the internet, a lot of people, actually, in fact, it's not even the admissions board. Just a lot of people don't really like that kind of stuff because it's just not unique, and you can just sense that. Like, you can appreciate the technical ability that goes into it, but that's a logical and conscious appreciation that sure is not an emotional appreciation, which is really where you get to the power of art and the power of design and architecture and so on. So anyway, so I did this study right here from Life, and I was sitting in front of the architecture building before I was going in for an information meeting. So I was just sitting there for like, I think it was 30, 40 minutes, something like that. And I just sketched this out because I found this door really interesting. And I talk about my whole process there. All right, so this is the one that I did to my brother. And I won't go too into it because it gets a little personal on his part, but I was really thinking about composition, so leading the viewer to the subject. So you can see that everything is just like pulling the eye right to his face, right? So if you squint your eyes, his face is generally a very high key value and a very large sum of darkness. And then also, I mean, there's just all these really flowing gestural lines, and it makes the subject feel a little more alive. And I talked about using gestural lines and, simple curves and simplifying your shapes in other videos. So if you're interested in how to do that, how to make your figures move a little bit more and make it a little more interesting, then I'd suggest checking some of that out. So this is actually a brush holder I made because Dramix Paint has this thing where he doesn't clean out his paint brushes. He does clean it out on paper towel, but he doesn't clean them out with solvents and all that other stuff. Turpentine, he doesn't use that. So he uses a solvent-free studio, and the way that he gets around your brushes drawing with paint is that he actually just dips it in slow dry medium, which is, I think he uses safflower oil, if I remember correctly, with a little bit of some essential oil that he puts in. Anyway, so that's how he makes his brush dip, and you can make it at home actually, or you can buy it on his website, but I'm not trying to endorse him. But I took the same sort of approach, and the problem was that it just dripped down the handles a bunch, and then when you're trying to paint, you had all this oil like on your hand. It was disgusting. Even if you were wearing gloves, it was gross. So I decided to make this ceramic piece, and I think it kind of cut up the flow a little bit nicely. Not that that's always a good thing, but in some places it is, because it kind of was just occasional sculpture, but it's oil painting. So I wanted to throw in a little bone here where it was just me trying something different. So here's just a ceramic piece that I did, and it's similar to kind of Japanese brush holder that I researched, but I designed it myself. You can see the sketch here, and then I fired it obviously, and it does its job really well. So I use it every day. I really like it. Oh yeah. So here was a mural that I was going to do for my high school, because I'm part of the International Baccalaureate program at my school, and for IB you have to do this project, and it's a really long-term project that you have to put a lot of work into, but you have to do it to actually graduate and get the particular IB diploma. So anyway, I'll spare you the details, but I had to make this large project, right? And I didn't really know what to do. I didn't want to do something boring, typical, like a soup drive or something like that. Like, I was more interested in taking what I was good at and then applying it. So I wanted to make a really big mural at my school, because a student done that years past, they did it for their project too. So I wanted to do something but make it cooler. So I did this this kind of rendering, and I think this might have been from a reference, but it was like loosely based on it. But I just did this initial sketch, and then I did this, and then I took this reference right here, as you can see, and then I did this small oil study, and that's what I actually sent to the admissions team, or not the admissions team, the administration office, and they approved the project. So I made the project, and then I actually painted the thing on the wall, and it's pretty big, as you can see. So if you have something of spectacular scale in your portfolio, you should probably have some sort of relative measurement. So either, or even really small scale, right? If you have a really small painting that you make, and the scale's the interesting part, you want to put like a pencil next to it, or your hand, or whatever. And for me, I just had myself standing next to it because I thought it'd make it more obvious how big this mural was. But here's the finished product. And I see it every day when I go to class. It's pretty cool, I think, at least. But, you know, a lot of these things, I think people are afraid to just go all out. You know what I mean? Like they're afraid that the admissions or the administration's office is going to say no, or they're going to be judged by their peers or some other stuff. And you're never going to see these people again. You know, it doesn't really matter if it was a total flop. At least you tried. You tried something really cool and ambitious. You know, so I thought that this was good for me, just crawling out of my shell. You know, just making a giant painting right where in the middle of in the school where people would see it. And I thought it was a good touch to my application, so I think it made it more interesting. Oh yeah, so here was my brother's cat died, and I wanted to make a memorial piece. So for this one, as you can see, I did a sketch of where I kind of wanted to move the clouds, and I was moving more towards realism plus imagination now. So I was kind of trying to wrap up my application where it started, or my portfolio where it started, and I made this digital kind of idea that I wanted to make. And I was using this reference here, and then also the sketch that I made. And then here's the final product. So that one wasn't too unique, but that's what it did. And then here is how I closed off my application. I wanted to make this architecture scene that reminded me of my childhood, like some of the things I'd seen this summer, and just some architectural stuff that I found interesting. You know, overhangs or this particular stone type, like materials. And this is kind of where I showed that I was thinking about how things went together. And I was thinking about how to use the way that I design my paintings in actual physical space. So I wired this whole thing electrically, as you can see, and I did a sketch originally, and I learned all about anode and cathode and, you know, the way that LEDs work, and I soldered all of it. And you can see here, it's very similar to that one building that I showed earlier, the Gnome Home, but it's just more work was put into it. It took a really long time, like the whole summer. But I made all these stones by hand out of clay, and then I oil painted all of them individually, and I laid down actual mortar in the walls to make it more stable, and then also used mortar on the floor to lay the bricks into. So yeah, and then here's the final product. So, oh yeah, so for this one too, I 3D modeled this lamp thing, and then it was in Blender, and then I actually got a resin printer as my Christmas gift, I think a year ago or so. So I printed those off, and it was just such a pain. I did it was very trial and error. I think I go talk about that in this process. It was really hard getting this process down to the word count because it was just so much stuff went into this project. But yeah, so I printed this off in a clear color. So you can print stuff in resin clear. And then I taped it off, and then I just spray painted it black so that only the windows would actually have light come through them. But yeah, so I designed this by hand. I didn't really use any references. I think I used one reference actually to kind of just loosely design the lamp off of, but I made it also so there's a little hole in the back so I could like insert the LED. But yeah, so this is how it came out. I was pretty happy with it. I also made this wagon and this other stuff through cutting up, you know, textiles, and then I placed this like fake grass that I got from Michael's and all this other stuff. But I thought it'd be kind of a cool way to say that I want to move on to the next stage of my life. So anyway, so I hope you guys learned something. Whatever reason you came here for, may have been out of interest for whatever reason, or, you know, if you wanted to do your own application, it doesn't really matter. I'm glad if you stayed this long. I appreciate you coming here. If you want to learn more about art, the way to design your paintings to become more technically competent, then I'd suggest you look at some more of my videos, and also some great other art YouTubers like I said, Dramix Paint, Marco Bucci, Stan Prokopenko. The list goes on. There's a lot of good sources here, and everybody can become a better artist. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed your